Portraits of a happy family. Bill Porter sat in the dark privacy of his home and contemplated the heartache to come. Such a sad and simple story. Two men in love with the same woman, and now a choice would have to be made, and for one, it would be a loss. Though perhaps it would be more accurate to say that there will be no winners in this little drama. The early morning shadows illuminated the atmosphere in the house, but not the mood, as Bill continued to run through scenarios in his head for a way out of the situation. Despite all the options, the outcome was the same. He would either have a life with the woman of his dreams, or he wouldn't. As he continued to study the glass of bourbon he had poured earlier but never touched, he resigned himself to the fact that his vote would not be the deciding vote. The decision would be Janet's. It would always be Janet's. He felt disappointed to realize that his fate would be in the hands of another. He swirled the glass aimlessly, deftly wielding his right hand. A pointless activity to pass the time. Time was passing, and he was vaguely aware that several hours had passed, and judging by the sharp, even lighting of the room, it was midday in the quiet den. Would it really go on like this? To suffer while the sword of fate played out this drama? With each passing second, the final decision drew nearer. A sense of weariness came over him as he shifted his gaze to the backyard. The change in view brought brief relief, as his thoughts were interrupted by the flight of the occasional cardinal or mockingbird that flew into the yard in search of sustenance. Oddly enough, he dozed off only to be awakened by the sound of a key unlocking the front door lock. Only he and Janet had such a key. Did her appearance mean she had chosen him? He realized he could not look her in the eye. Unable to look at her, he heard the sound of the door closing and footsteps coming to him from the hallway. So he was still staring at the backyard. His thoughts were racing along with his pulse. This had to be a good sign, didn't it? She was here, not with him. This had to be good news. Unless she felt obligated to be the bearer of bad news, some sort of moral obligation to put him to the choice and explain why he'd lost. Mixed feelings of hope and fear tormented him. He felt someone's presence beside him. Then a white flash of light blinded his vision, accompanied by an excruciating pain that reverberated in his skull. His muscles went rigid, and he collapsed into the chaise lounge. Another blow followed, with a similar effect. The glass fell out of his hand and hit the floor of the room, spilling its contents. His head whipped from side to side, reacting to each blow. An overwhelming nausea flooded him as he lost consciousness. When he awoke, he felt an eerie dizziness that made it seem as if the room was spinning. He moved slowly, and every effort caused a shooting pain in his body. The acrid iron taste of blood appeared in his mouth. He felt his head swell even though he couldn't see. His vision was blurred, and he tried to concentrate on forcing his facial muscles to open his vision to clear it. This succeeded with difficulty. He vaguely heard soft moans, and as he continued to regain consciousness, it became clear that the moans were coming from himself. A sharp pain pierced his side, and he reacted to it by pushing himself to the side. He then realized he was on the floor of the den, and somehow landed on the glass he had previously been holding. From his movement, the glass rolled across the floor. The relief was hardly worth the effort to reduce the discomfort. He continued to gasp in pain as his thoughts cleared. Why had this happened? How had this happened? What transgression could he have committed toward Janet that she would react to him with such cruelty? So many questions to figure out what had happened. As he struggled to raise his head, the answers to some of the questions appeared on their own. At first, all he could see were the boots. Then, as far as his eyes allowed, he discerned the legs of his pants, his torso, and finally, towering above him, an enraged face framed by the ceiling of the room. Frank Merriman. Bill Porter sank back into unconsciousness. When he regained consciousness, he saw his assailant sitting in the chair in which he had been seated before. In one hand, he had the exact same glass filled with expensive rare bourbon that Bill Porter was about to drink. In the other was a Colt automatic model 1911 pistol, pointed indifferently in Bill's direction. Frank Merriman, his neighbor of 10 years, his friend, and now also a rival for Janet's heart. How did it happen? First instant attraction, then harmless flirting, followed by an affair. Then secret lunches, then secret dinners. Each encounter drew them into an inevitable whirlpool, and then came the successful culmination of an affair that grew into romance, which grew into love, and then came the revelation of the situation. And now Bill Porter realized that Frank Merriman was also weighing how to handle the situation. Unfortunately for Bill, it required a more proactive approach. "It's time you woke up, you pathetic dude." "As you may have guessed, I borrowed the key to your little love nest from Janet," Frank growled. "I hope you don't mind if I drink your precious booze. It's the least you can do for me since I had to share Janet with you." Frank took a small sip, and it gave him almost as much pleasure as the sight of a battered Bill Porter prostrate on the floor. "All you had to do was walk away and leave us alone." "But no, Bill, you couldn't do that. You kept screwing Janet up and screwing Janet up, filling her head with nonsense. Did you really think I was going to let you get away with it?" Frank asked ominously. 10 years, Bill. 10 long years you've come between me and Janet, and today it ends, Bill," shouted Frank. Bill tried desperately to think of something to calm Frank down, but nothing came to mind as Frank continued his tirade. "Do you have any idea the disgust I felt, knowing that you had touched her, held her in your arms, kissed her, loved her?" The pain in Frank's voice made him gasp at the picture of Janet's betrayal. Frank took aim at Bill's body, contemplating where to shoot first. "Where should I shoot first, Bill? The obvious answer is in the balls, but maybe I'll save that for later. I just haven't decided yet." Bill Porter began to move his lips. The first sound was a quacking as he tried to get his vocal cords to work. "Frank," he gasped, "you don't want to do this. If you kill me, you'll go to jail, Frank, and you don't want to do that. Right now, we can both walk away from this, but if you pull that trigger, there will be consequences. Consequences beyond our control." In some part of Frank's brain, this information was received and digested, and the gun slowly went down. Frank took another sip of bourbon, glaring angrily at Bill. "You think you're so damn smart," Frank hissed. "I'm not afraid to go to jail just so long as you're dead and buried." "Frank, for 10 years we lived across the street from each other. Are you saying you hate me so much that you want to spend the rest of your life in jail?" Bill protested. Frank replied, "For what you did to Janet, for what you did to me, for what you did to my family. Yes, I'll try my luck in court," Bill exclaimed in despair. "Look, Frank, Janet has—" At the mention of Janet's name, Frank jumped up from his chair and started kicking Bill's defenseless body. "Don't, never, mention her name ever again," Frank shouted, and each word was followed by a vicious kick. Each blow made Bill's body shudder with pain, and once again he passed out from his injuries. How long he lay passed out he didn't know, but eventually he groaned again, which signaled to Frank that Bill was coming to his senses. Bill cried out in pain. His entire body was bruised from the blows. He was sure he had several broken ribs. His arms were sore and numb from the blows. Somehow, during the fight, he had curled up into a fetal position, which prevented Frank from reaching his groin area. But Bill could tell that several blows came to his buttocks, thighs, and pelvis, trying to get to his most vulnerable spot. Frank returned to the chair. In the meantime, he had managed to fill his glass. Studying his victim, he said, "That's it. Cry like a little girl." Bill's body revolted, and he suddenly vomited. As he continued to squirm in the slurry, he heard Frank's laughter. Then the spasms ended, and he sank into the stench of vomit, while Frank continued to enjoy the scenario. "Oh, Billy boy, what surprises you have today," Frank muttered mockingly. "Not the least of which is the one about Karen and Jimmy." "Yes, my kids, Karen and Jimmy." Frank sympathized. I know Janet lied to you and told you they were yours. You liked to think that, didn't you? Frank chuckled. And you know what, Mr. Great and Powerful Bastard? I did the paternity tests and they're both mine. Thank God Janet has been honest with me this whole time. The very thought of having a child with Janet. Bill could see the intent to kill appear on Frank's face. Before he could gather his strength, Frank raised the gun again. The barrel with the cave-like opening was pointed right at him, and Frank's face was like death itself as he pulled the trigger. Bill saw the flames from the shot burst and the bullet enter his body. Only then did he realize that he never heard the sound of the shot. The moment the blood rushed from his body, Bill experienced a shock. In that moment, Bill realized that he was going to die today. Frank had crossed the line, and nothing would stop him from killing the man he held responsible for his torment. Strangely enough, another bullet didn't follow. "I want you to suffer, you bastard!" Frank shouted. "I won't see you burn in hell, so you'll live as long as I can keep you alive." Frank began to rant non-stop about all the misdemeanors he suffered because of Bill. Infinity passed, and the distant sounds of sirens were heard in the neighborhood. As the sirens drew closer, the Doppler effect built up. Suddenly, as the cacophony reached a climax, they fell menacingly silent. From the loudspeakers came unfamiliar and muffled voices insisting on being informed of what was happening. "Do you think they'll save you, Billy boy? Nothing on God's green earth will do that," Frank declared, waving his gun. He continued his tirade. Bill leaned back in despair and stared out into the backyard, which would probably be the last thing he would ever see. Then some movement began behind his fence. Puzzled, he watched some object being lowered to the ground. Bill had attended enough Chicago Bears soccer games to recognize the object as a parabolic microphone. Finally, the police would be able to hear, evaluate, and determine next steps. All that was left for Bill was to hang on, and maybe he could survive. The phone rang, and Bill realized it was the police negotiator trying to make contact to discuss the situation. Bill was weakening from blood loss and wasn't sure of the severity of the bullet wound. It was possible that this shot would prove fatal. Bill's only chance would be for the police to intervene and rescue him. He now noticed several people lying on the roof of a neighboring house. It must be a SWAT team awaiting orders. He noticed small red dots playing on the walls of the den, on which dusk was now descending. Some lights began to cross over to him, others to Frank. In the fog of scant information, the police did not know who the culprit was. Frank got up and took the receiver off the lever. Now he paced around the room, continuing to rant. But his behavior was becoming increasingly manic. The red dots were desperately trying to stay on his body. Because of his focus on the task at hand, Frank didn't notice the laser beams that were aiming the sights of the sniper rifles. Then Frank stopped, the decision was made, and Bill watched the weapons being pointed at him again. Frank gritted his teeth and said, "Rotten hell, Bill!" Then an explosive stream of blood surged over Frank's head. The gun flew aside, and Frank collapsed to the ground like a tree cut down by a lumberjack. With the echo of the gunshot, a flood of SWAT teams rushed into the house, bursting through every door. The first priority was to clear the scene before any assistance could be rendered. This was quickly accomplished as the police officers continued to enter the house. Bill noticed that little attention was paid to the dead man's body after Frank's gun was taken away. This made Bill realize that Frank had been mortally wounded. Meanwhile, in the noise of conversations, Bill heard the order for the EMTs to enter the house and treat the wounded. At that moment, amidst the noise and chaos, Janet somehow appeared. As she looked around the room, her eyes lingered briefly on Bill, waiting for the paramedics to arrive and the gurney on which he was to be taken to the emergency room. Then she spotted Frank. "Oh, God, no!" she shrieked earnestly. "No, Frank, don't leave me!" With those words, she threw herself on top of the bloody corpse and cradled it against her. The bewildered policeman froze, not knowing what to do. One or two officers tried to pull her away from the body, but Janet held on even tighter. Then the officer, apparently in charge, growled, "Get this man and his wife to the hospital as soon as possible, you hear me?" With those words, the medics and the gurney that had been headed for Bill were thrown over to Frank. They then began to pretend that Frank was alive so that Janet would let him go. As they wheeled him out, Janet asked if she could ride with him to the hospital. They gently assured her that she could. Watching her disappear from his house, Bill knew that when they got there, Frank's body would be admitted to the emergency room, only to be pronounced dead on arrival. By that time, the hospital would already have psychologists on hand to care for a grieving Janet, and her friends and family would be notified of her loss. Bill felt a subtle change in the room after Janet left. He had to wait for another ambulance to be sent to his house after the first one left with Janet and Frank. He was coldly informed that the estimated time of arrival was 15 minutes. Despite all his injuries, including the gunshot wound, he was in no danger. At this point, he was receiving only the minimal care necessary because of the sympathy of the entire audience for Janet and Frank. He noticed several of the officers looking at him with disgust or open contempt, though still maintaining a professional approach to their duties at the scene. Bill began to have doubts himself. Should he have warned Frank? If he had, perhaps Frank would be alive and Janet would not be worried about her loss. The shock had begun to wear off, and now Bill was in agony as he continued to wait for the ambulance. No one showed much interest in his plight. Fortunately, a second ambulance arrived and the paramedics began preparing him for the ride. After he was moved onto a gurney, a senior officer finally approached him. "I'm Inspector O'Henry. This is Lieutenant Mallory of the SWAT team." He pointed to the officer who had been staring at Bill the whole time. Inspector O'Henry continued, "I want you to meet the officer who had to kill this poor woman's husband today, all because you decided to seduce his wife. I hope you're happy with the way things turned out and can live with the guilt of making this woman a widow." Bill was exhausted, and it was evident that he was rapidly losing consciousness as the EMTs put a breathing mask on him. Nevertheless, he managed to stop them from putting the mask on. He mumbled something to the inspector. "What did you say?" Inspector O'Henry demanded with open contempt. With his last strength, Bill pointed to the wall, and with all the agony of which he was capable, said, "She's not a widow." Bill noticed the surprised look on Inspector O'Henry's face as he stared at the large wedding photograph of Mr. and Mrs. Bill and Janet Porter hanging over the fireplace. Around it hung a typical family photos of Bill, Janet, and the children, Karen and Jimmy in various poses, portraits of a happy family. Bill's last vision before he sank into Morpheus land was the sad, apologetic look in Inspector O'Henry's eyes. The end.